When we talk about poor people or poverty, we only tend to think of beggars on the road. However, all people who are poor are not beggars. Poor people could be laborers, landless farm workers, daily wage earners, and children working at roadside food joints and tea stalls. Before we proceed, let us look at a definition of poverty. Poverty can be defined as the lack of common things like food, clothing, shelter, safe drinking water, medical care, and education, which determine the quality of life. Poverty is a worldwide challenge. However, the problem is more severe in India. Nearly 25% of our entire population lives in poverty. This means India has around 26 crore poor people, which is the largest for any country in the world. Not all people living in cities are rich, and not all people living in villages are poor. Poverty exists in both urban and rural India. There are certain things that are common in the life of poor people in urban and rural India. These include hunger and malnutrition, lack of proper housing and shelter. They cannot get health care in case of illness, and have no regular job and income. There is also lack of sanitation and safe drinking water. There is no education for children who often work as child laborers. There is hopelessness about life and ill treatment from others who are better off. Mahatma Gandhi devoted his life to India's poor. He said poverty is the worst form of violence. He insisted that true independence for India will come only when its poorest people become free of suffering. Social scientists use different types of indicators to understand poverty. The most commonly used indicators relate to the levels of income of people and their consumption of goods. Now, poverty is also observed using other social indicators like lack of education, health care, sanitation, and safe drinking water. Social scientists these days are concerned about the concepts of social exclusion and vulnerability associated with poverty. Let us study these concepts in detail. The concept of social exclusion states that poor people have to live in poor surroundings, excluded from neighborhoods of people who are better off. Social exclusion can be both an effect and a cause of poverty. A person may be forced to live in poor surroundings because he or she is poor. Also, a person may be poor because he stays in poor surroundings where he has no means to improve his income and situation. People living in slums are excluded from facilities and benefits like clean surroundings, good roads, and clean water supply that people who are better off enjoy. Social exclusion excludes people from equal opportunities of education, health care, employment, and general quality of life. Vulnerability is the measure of the probability of certain groups of people becoming poor or remaining poor in future. Vulnerability is determined by the availability of options for employment, education, and health care, etc. For example, landless farm laborers with limited options for education, health care, and employment are more vulnerable to remaining poor in the years to come in comparison with farmers who own land. Vulnerability is also determined by the ability of people to handle bad times and natural disasters like earthquakes, floods, and tsunamis. People who are already poor or do not have the means to cope with such hard times are more vulnerable to poverty in the times to come. The government has launched several welfare schemes for the poor. To ensure that these benefits reach the correct people, it is important to have a way to identify them. The poverty line is a commonly used way to identify the poor. It is a measure based on levels on income and consumption by people. The concept of poverty line is based on the fact that a person must have a minimum level of income and consumption to satisfy the basic needs of food, clothing, clean water, education, and healthcare. When the income or consumption of a person falls below this minimum level, the person is considered to be poor. Poverty exists in all countries of the world. However, the minimum levels of requirement to determine the poverty line are different in different countries. While in the rich developed nations, a person may be considered poor for not owning a vehicle or a house, in the developing nations, not being able to buy 2 meals a day may be the criterion for poverty. In India, the determination of the poverty line takes into consideration the minimum requirements of food, clothing, footwear, fuel, power, education, and healthcare for the subsistence of an individual. Food consists of many different types of items. So, how does one decide what is the minimum requirement of food? This is done by taking the minimum calorie requirement into consideration. In India, the minimum daily requirement is fixed at 2,400 calories per person in rural areas and 2,100 calories per person in urban areas. The difference in the daily calorie requirement in rural and urban areas is because people in rural areas do more physical labor and, therefore, need more calories. The cost of each item in the minimum requirements of food, clothing, footwear, fuel, power, education, and healthcare is added up to find the minimum income required for a person to survive. In the year 2000, the monthly poverty line income was fixed at 328 rupees per person in rural areas and 454 rupees per person in urban areas. Note that though the calorie requirement for the people in rural areas is more, their poverty line income is less than the people in urban areas. This is because things are usually less expensive in villages than in big towns and cities. Also note that the poverty line income is fixed on a per-person basis. Thus, to find the poverty line for a family, this monthly income is multiplied by the number of members in the family. The poverty line is revised periodically to accommodate rising prices and the changing requirements of people. This work is done through nationwide surveys conducted by the National Sample Survey Organization. Poverty line income is different in different countries. However, to draw comparisons between nations, the World Bank uses the standard poverty line income of $1 per person per day in all the developing countries. The graph here shows the change in the percentage of population living under the poverty line in India from 1973 to 2000. the percentages have come down. Yet, the percentage of poor in rural areas continues to be higher than in urban areas. Here's another graph that shows the number of poor people living under the poverty line in India for the period 1973 to 2000. Observe that though the combined poverty ratio came down from 54.9 to 36% between 1973 and 1994, the total number of poor people in India remained almost unchanged. This is due to the poor economic growth in addition to the rise in India's population during the period. Some groups and communities are more vulnerable to poverty than others. Some of the groups most vulnerable to poverty are people belonging to the scheduled castes and tribes, casual laborers in urban areas, and landless farm laborers in rural areas. The graph here shows that 51 people out of every 100 people belonging to the scheduled tribes live below the poverty line. Similarly, 50 out of every 100 casual laborers in urban areas are poor. This figure is 47 and 43 for farm laborers and people belonging to the scheduled castes, respectively. All these figures are much higher than the national average, where 26 out of every 100 people live below the poverty line. The situation is worse for people belonging to more than one of these most vulnerable groups. For example, a landless farm laborer who belongs to a scheduled tribe is usually poorer than other farm laborers belonging to higher castes. The scheduled tribes continue to be the most vulnerable group, as studies show no decline in the poverty of these people. The other three groups, however, have shown some decline in poverty in the last decade. Even within a family, some people are more vulnerable and suffer more than the others due to poverty. These include the elderly, women, and children, especially girl children. These people receive the least amount of care and share in the limited resources of the family. One of the biggest social evils associated with poverty is negligence towards the girl child. Girls are often considered a liability and are not given the same nourishment or opportunities for education as the boys. Poverty is a problem in all the 28 states and 7 union territories of India. However, the poverty ratio, or the percentage of population living in poverty, is not uniform all over the country. It varies across different states, as you can see from the graph here. Orissa, with a poverty ratio of 47%, and Bihar, with a poverty ratio of 43%, are the two poorest states in India. Besides Orissa and Bihar, the poverty ratios in Madhya Pradesh, Assam, Tripura, and Uttar Pradesh are also much higher than the All India poverty ratio of 26.1. At the other end of the graph, the states of Haryana, Himachal Pradesh, Punjab, and Jammu and Kashmir, along with the Union Territory of Delhi, have the lowest poverty ratios in the country. Since the 1970s, there has been a general decline in the poverty ratios for all states in India. Here again, some states have done better than the others.